He was standing on a chair, not robbing a train, not holding up a bank, not fleeing a posse across the Missouri plains. He was dusting a picture frame. And in that one careless moment, he set down the two revolvers he had worn every single day for 15 years. Two men in the room behind him saw their chance. Within seconds, Jesse James was dead, shot in the back of the head. But here's what every Hollywood movie, every history class, and almost every documentary gets completely wrong. The guns Jesse James carried weren't just six shooters. They weren't just props in a Wild West myth. They were precision instruments, chosen deliberately, modified carefully, and more lethal than anything the people chasing him were carrying. The man who learned to shoot before he learned to shave. Jesse James was born into a world that was already preparing to tear itself apart. His father was a Baptist minister and hemp farmer. His mother, Zerelda, didn't flinch at much. She would prove that later. Missouri in the 1850s wasn't just a state, it was a battleground. Slavery's western frontier. Abolitionists pressing in from Kansas, pro-slavery settlers digging in hard. The tension had been building for a decade before the Civil War's first shots were fired. Jesse was 9 when the conflict spilled into his county. By the time he was 15, it had come directly to his front door. A Union militia unit rode onto the James family farm looking for his older brother Frank, who had joined the Confederate guerrilla outfit known as Quantrill's Raiders. When they didn't find Frank, they took it out on Jesse. He was dragged out of the field, beaten, and left in the dirt. That was the moment Jesse James picked up a gun and didn't put it down for the rest of his life. He joined the Bushwhackers under Bloody Bill Anderson, a splinter faction of Quantrill's Raiders that had graduated from ambushes to outright massacres. They attacked in fast-moving groups, fired from horseback, and didn't take prisoners. For 2 years, Jesse James fired revolvers in live combat, at other human beings, at close range, in chaotic ambushes where the only thing keeping you breathing was being faster than the man 20 feet away. What made the Bushwhackers specifically dangerous wasn't just their willingness to kill. It was the speed at which they decided to do it. A conventional cavalry engagement involved formations, orders, and controlled volleys. Guerrilla ambushes were decided in seconds. You identified your target, you drew, you fired. If you hesitated for any reason, or if your hand slipped, if your grip was wrong, if your gun was the slower one, the man across from you didn't hesitate. Those 2 years with Bloody Bill Anderson didn't just teach Jesse James to shoot. They taught him to think about shooting the way a carpenter thinks about tools. Which one works best for which job? How to maintain it? How to carry it? How to access it in conditions that would make most people freeze entirely? By the time he was 18, Jesse James had a more sophisticated understanding of close-quarters firearms than most soldiers acquired in an entire war. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, Jesse had been fighting for 2 years. He was 18. He had been shot multiple times, and he had no idea how to do anything except shoot. The Reconstruction era barred former guerrillas from voting and many professions. The banks holding their mortgages were owned by men who had fought on the other side. If the system was already treating him like a criminal, Jesse figured he'd give them a reason. The Clay County Savings Association robbery was the first bank heist in American history carried out in broad daylight by an armed gang. Historians debate whether Jesse was there. Frank James was, along with men forged in the same guerrilla units that shaped Jesse's adolescence. The James Younger gang was open for business. The guns, what Jesse James actually carried, and why this is where the story gets specific. And specific is what most people skip over. Ask someone what gun Jesse James carried and they'll say a Colt. They're not entirely wrong. But they're missing the part that actually explains how a man who spent 16 years robbing banks and trains was never once caught in the act. The Colt Single Action Army. 45 caliber, introduced 1873. Everyone knows this gun, called the Peacemaker, which is one of the great ironies of firearms history. 6 rounds, single action, accurate, reliable. The standard U.S. Army sidearm from 1873, which meant it was everywhere. Jesse carried these, but the Colt was not his most important weapon. The Smith & Wesson Model 3, known as the Schofield. 45 caliber. Here is where it gets interesting. The Colt reloads 1 cartridge at a time. You rotate the cylinder manually, push out the spent case, load the new round. To fully reload 6 chambers, an experienced shooter needs between 15 and 25 seconds. In the middle of a robbery, that's an eternity. The Smith & Wesson Schofield was a top-break revolver. Push a latch, the barrel hinged downward, and all 6 spent cartridges ejected simultaneously from a star-shaped extractor. One motion, all 6 cases, gone. Then you loaded fresh rounds and snapped the gun shut. 4 to 6 seconds versus 15 to 25. In a bank, with people screaming, horses outside, a marshal potentially walking through the door. That difference wasn't just an advantage. It was the margin between getting away and getting buried. Jesse understood this not from a classroom but from firefights. The man who runs dry first usually doesn't make it home. The James Younger gang standardized on the Schofield. Investigators who later analyzed the gang's robbery patterns noted how rarely they were caught in extended gunfights. They moved fast and were gone before anyone organized a response. The Schofield was a major reason why. There is another detail about the Schofield that rarely gets mentioned. The gun was balanced differently from the Colt. The top break design shifted weight distribution toward the barrel rather than the grip. For a shooter who drew quickly and fired at close range, this mattered. The Colt's balance encouraged the wrist to drop slightly on the draw. The Schofield's weight kept the barrel naturally level. That sounds minor until you consider that a bank lobby is not a shooting range. There is no time to correct your aim. The first shot either ends the situation or it doesn't. Jesse James had spent years in conditions where that distinction cost lives. He chose the gun whose natural balance aligned with how he actually used it. That is not something a person figures out from reading a catalog. That is something a person learns from experience that most people would never survive long enough to accumulate. Period accounts describe Jesse drawing with unusual speed for the era. Factory grips were designed for an average hand. Multiple accounts describe Jesse replacing them with custom-fitted alternatives, thinner profiles, sometimes ivory, which was lighter, and gave a different texture under wet or cold hands. In a fast draw situation, a fraction of a second was the difference between clearing the holster cleanly and fumbling. Jesse had been in enough situations where fumbling meant dying. He eliminated the fumble. Ammunition selection. By the late 1870s, Jesse had largely settled on firearms chambered in .4440 Winchester center fire. The reason was practical. The Winchester Model 1873 rifle, which gang members carried in addition to their sidearms, was also chambered in .4440. One cartridge, 2 weapons. In the 1870s, when ammunition was purchased, traded, or stolen from whatever was available, shared calibers meant you were never holding rifle rounds with empty pistols, or loaded pistols with a dry rifle. Jesse James figured that out before he was 25. The robberies, how the guns were actually used between 1866 and 1882. The James Younger gang carried out more than a dozen bank robberies, 7 train robberies, and multiple stagecoach holdups across at least 11 states. But the numbers don't capture the method. The method is what made the difference between a criminal gang and something that terrified law enforcement for 15 years. The gang ran on tactics refined during the guerrilla war: speed, surprise, overwhelming initial force. They arrived fast in numbers and made the threat clear immediately. Gallatin, Missouri. Jesse and Frank James walked into the Daviess County Savings Bank. Jesse approached the cashier, John Sheets, who he believed had been a Union militia captain responsible for the death of Bloody Bill Anderson. Historians still debate whether the identification was correct. What isn't debated is what happened next. Jesse shot Sheets twice, point blank. Frank covered the room. They took the cash, roughly $700, and walked out. One man killed. Witnesses, broad daylight, gone before anyone outside processed it. The lesson Jesse took was that hesitation was a liability. From that point forward, the gang ran a clear protocol. Inside, men controlled the space. Outside, men held the horses. Anyone who suggested resistance got a revolver in their face before the thought was fully formed. The guns made that protocol work. The Schofield's fast reload meant inside men never went dry. Matched calibers meant ammunition could move between gang members instantly. Multiple armed men in a confined space meant rational people did the only sensible thing. They stayed still and let it happen. The Blue Cut robbery of September 7, 1881 showed how refined the system had become. The Chicago and Alton Railroad train was stopped on a curve in Jackson County, Missouri, a stretch Jesse had chosen deliberately because the curve slowed the train, and the embankment on both sides gave the gang elevated ground. 8 men, 2 groups, one on each side of the tracks. When the train slowed, they boarded simultaneously from both sides. The passenger cars were controlled before a single alarm could be raised. The express car yielded cash. Watches collected from the passengers added to the take. The entire operation from the moment the train stopped to the moment the gang rode away took under 40 minutes. A witness later told investigators the gang departed without any apparent urgency. No shouting, no chaos. Just men on horses disappearing into the Missouri tree line. The witness said it was the calmness that frightened him most. Not the guns. The calmness. Train robberies were operationally different. Banks were static and predictable. Trains were moving, crowded with civilian passengers, staffed with armed express guards, and capable of shifting the tactical picture in seconds. The gang would board as passengers, armed but concealed. The inside team took control of the passenger cars first, establishing compliance. A separate team dealt with the engine crew and express car simultaneously. The express car was the problem. Heavy wood construction, armed messengers inside, doors locked from within. The solution was brutal in its simplicity. Jesse didn't break in. He made staying in more dangerous than coming out. Guards who refused were told through the car's walls that the passengers next door would pay the consequences instead. The revolver was the instrument. But the real weapon was the certainty Jesse projected. People who encountered him during robberies described it consistently in court testimony. He wasn't agitated. He was calm in a way that was more frightening than rage. That calmness came from having been shot at so many times that being shot at had stopped registering as an emergency. The mythology versus the reality, what Hollywood got completely wrong. The movies give us a Jesse James who fans the hammer while drawing with a flourish, shoots accurately at 50 yards from full gallop, and twirls his pistol back into the holster after every encounter. Let's go through those one at a time. Fanning the hammer. Fanning, where you hold the trigger down and slap the hammer with your palm, is real. It was used. What it is not is accurate. Beyond 10 feet, fanning turns 6 precise rounds into 6 rounds going in the general direction of the target. Jesse James was in the business of controlled, deliberate shots at close range that ended situations immediately. The Schofield's smooth action rewarded aimed fire. Fanning was a show. Jesse James didn't do shows. Trained hits at 25 yards were possible, but the sights were rudimentary, the triggers heavy, and black powder cartridges produced enough smoke to obscure your sightline after the second or third shot. Every authenticated account places the distance at under 30 feet, usually under 15. At 15 feet with a Schofield, a hit was functionally unsurvivable. That was the point. Shooting from horseback. The gang fired from horseback on confirmed occasions, most notably at Northfield. But everything about Jesse's approach was designed to avoid that situation. Shooting from a moving horse at a moving target is one of the hardest things a person can do with a handgun. Jesse survived 15 years by avoiding the scenario, not by mastering it. And Northfield proved exactly what happened when he couldn't avoid it. Northfield was the single worst day in the history of the James Younger gang. The gang rode in with 8 men targeting the First National Bank. Everything should have followed the standard playbook. It didn't. The townspeople fought back. Hardware store owner Anselm Manning grabbed a rifle and opened fire from across the street. Medical student Henry Wheeler did the same from a hotel window above. Other citizens joined with whatever they had. The gang's revolvers were close-quarters weapons up against rifles firing from distance and elevation. That firefight was exactly the scenario Jesse's entire system was designed to avoid. 2 gang members, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, were killed in the street. The 3 younger brothers were all wounded. Cole Younger took 11 bullets and survived. The James brothers escaped. The Youngers were captured. The gang that had operated for a decade was finished in one afternoon in a small Minnesota town. Northfield proved something important. Jesse's guns were optimized for specific conditions: surprise, interior spaces, controlled distances. The Schofield's 4-second reload meant nothing when the person across the street had a lever-action rifle putting 10 rounds downrange in 12 seconds from cover. He had built a system that worked under specific circumstances. When circumstances changed, so did the results. Jesse spent nearly 5 years rebuilding after Northfield. The younger brothers were in prison. The original gang was gone. But Jesse didn't stop. He assembled a new crew, younger men, less experienced, more unpredictable. And here is where his approach to his weapons tells you something important about the man. The tight protocols that had defined the James Younger gang, the standardized guns, the matched calibers, the disciplined interior control, had existed because the men around Jesse understood them. The new recruits didn't. That erosion showed in the robberies of 1879 through 1881. The operations were sloppier, the violence less controlled. And Jesse, for the first time, began operating under an alias, living in St. Joseph under the name Thomas Howard. The guns were still there, but the system had frayed. And a frayed system was what Robert Ford was counting on. The guns after Jesse. What happened to the revolvers? Jesse James was killed on April 3, 1882. Robert Ford had made a deal with Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden. The reward was $10,000, dead or alive. Ford shot Jesse with a Smith & Wesson Model .344 caliber. Jesse had set down his own two guns while dusting the picture frame. He heard something. He turned. One shot. Back of the head. The two revolvers Jesse set down that morning became objects of immediate and intense historical interest. And that is where the story of his guns gets complicated in a way nobody talks about. In the years after Jesse's death, more revolvers were attributed to him than he could possibly have owned. The commercial value created an industry of fraudulent attribution that muddied the record for over a century. Authentication is genuinely difficult. The revolvers of the 1870s were not serialized in the modern sense. Factory records from Colt and Smith & Wesson are incomplete. Part of the reason so many fakes entered circulation was the sheer intensity of public obsession with Jesse James in the years immediately after his death. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been hired to catch him as far back as 1874. What they learned over 8 years of failed pursuit became part of his legend. Alan Pinkerton himself noted in internal correspondence that the gang's speed of operation made conventional law enforcement responses useless. By the time a sheriff organized a posse and reached the scene, the gang had a 2-hour head start and had scattered in 3 directions. The Pinkertons tried a direct raid on the James family farm in January 1875. They threw an incendiary device through a window. Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother Archie was killed. Jesse's mother lost her arm. Jesse was not there. The raid became a national scandal, generated enormous public sympathy, and made the Pinkerton agency look incompetent. It did not slow Jesse down at all, but it turned him into something more than a criminal in the public mind. It turned him into a man the government was trying to destroy. And people who believed that were willing to pay serious money for anything he had touched. The Smith & Wesson Model 3 that Robert Ford used has a clearer chain of custody than most of Jesse's own guns. Ford was arrested within hours, convicted of murder within a day, then immediately pardoned by Governor Crittenden. He kept the gun. Ford spent years performing in stage shows reenacting the killing. He became a target. In the mythology of the West, shooting a man in the back of the head was the deepest kind of cowardice, even if the man was Jesse James. 10 years later, Robert Ford was shot and killed in his own saloon by a man named Edward O'Kelly. No particular personal grudge. He just thought killing the man who killed Jesse James would make him famous. O'Kelly was right. For about a week. The Smith & Wesson Ford used passed into a private collection and is not on display. The 2 Schofields Jesse had been carrying were taken as evidence. One reportedly went to the James family. The other entered the murky world of frontier memorabilia, where documentation became whatever the owner needed it to be. What is documented in newspaper accounts, court testimony, and lawmen's records is what those guns represented while they were in Jesse James's hands, not props, not symbols. Tools of a trade he had been practicing since he was 15. The real legacy of Jesse James's revolvers. The mythology of Jesse James was constructed almost immediately after his death. Dime novels first, stage shows next. By the time motion pictures arrived, Jesse had already been transformed into what America needed: a Robin Hood, a rebel, a man who fought the banks and railroads on behalf of the ordinary farmer. The banks he robbed were small-town institutions serving the same farmers his mythology claimed he defended. The money stayed with his gang. There is no documented case of Jesse James giving stolen money to anyone who wasn't riding with him. But the mythology required a hero, so a hero was constructed. The revolvers became part of it. Precise, deadly, romantic. The guns of a man who stood outside the law and principle rather than out of training and necessity. The real Jesse James was more interesting than the myth. He was a product of a specific historical moment. A boy shaped by guerrilla warfare before his identity had fully formed. A man who turned a military education in violence into the longest criminal career in American frontier history. He wasn't lucky. He was methodical. His gun choices reflected genuine tactical thinking. His operational protocols reflected hard-won combat experience. And the calmness witnesses described was the calmness of a man who had made peace with the likelihood of dying because the alternative was being too afraid to function. The revolvers were the physical expression of that. Not magical, not legendary in themselves, just well-chosen tools in the hands of a man who understood one thing very early in life. The man who thought most carefully about his weapon usually outlived the man who didn't. Jesse James thought about his weapons for 15 years. And he was right about almost everything, until the morning he set them down. So now you know the real story of the revolvers that kept Jesse James alive for 15 years. The tactical thinking behind the Schofield, the caliber standardization, the grip modifications, the operational system that almost no one has bothered to explain before. If you want to go deeper on the gunfighters of the Old West, I have a full breakdown of how Wyatt Earp actually used firearms, and it is not what the movies show either. That video is on screen right now. Click it. And subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Real history of the Old West every week. No myth. Just what actually happened.